Hello, this is webcast 2 of week 14, and we're continuing our webcast on special effects. This webcast, I'm just going to focus on two real popular effects. We'll be saving the feather and transparency for the next webcast, but we're going to focus on drop shadow and bevel and emboss. I think drop shadow is probably one of the most popular effects that anyone uses, but it just so happens that bevel and emboss is probably the most versatile. So I thought those would be two good ones to put together in the same webcast. I have a file here which has several items that we're going to talk about because a shadow can impact these a little bit differently. The first one I'm going to do over here is just a standard image. And from the previous webcast, we know I can access this special effect by either going to my effects panel. Let me get it out of the way here so we can bring that dialog up. Or going up to my control panel, or going to the object menu and choosing effects. So I'm going to go to the effects panel because I used the control panel so much in the last one and just want you to see how I would access it from this one. And I've got the menu that's attached to the little FX icon. I'm going to hold that down and choose drop shadow. Immediately the drop shadow defaults are applied to the image that is selected. And now I can go in and refine these a little bit if I want to. And this is the typical way you are going to apply any of these effects, is just click on the effect. From the drop-down menu, you'll see that it has a checkbox that has been turned on, and then those particular effects will show up. If you have multiple effects applied, so let's say that I also choose to apply bevel and emboss, you may get confused about what effect you're looking at. So be sure that you click on the effect itself, not just the checkbox, and that dialog box will update with the specifications for that effect. I'm going to turn off bevel and emboss because I really want to focus here on drop shadow. But I'm still seeing the bevel and emboss specifications, even though that they're lightened because they're not accessible since I turned it off. So I'm going to go back and click on the words drop shadow, highlighting that blue bar so that I see those attributes that I can apply to the drop shadow. The first thing we see is our blending mode, and that is usually multiplied because we want that drop shadow to be darker. And you have the choice of how opaque you want that to be. So I'm going to go out just for a moment here, and I'm going to just draw a circle, fill it with anything here. All right, and I'm going to place it in back. So I'm going to click on it, go to my range command, and choose send to back. Now let's take a look here at where that drop shadow, and in fact maybe I want to something like yellow. Here we go. I think that's a little bit easier. You can see that the drop shadow is see-through, progressively more see-through, more transparent as I move away from the object. So let me go back and push this over to the side. I'm going to go back to the drop shadow dialog. And if I change this to 100%, I've got the wrong object. Not what I had in mind. So let's turn this off for this. And let me click back on my eagle. Sorry about that. If I make this 100% opaque, this whole area underneath until I get to the very edge of that feather is going to be completely opaque. I won't be able to see anything underneath it. So the default is 75. But you could lighten that up if you wanted to, if you thought that was too dark. And you can see as I drag this to the left, if I get it down to 0, though a drop shadow has been applied to this, I can't see it because it's completely opaque. So I'm going to bring that back up to the default. And it's really nice to be able to have your artwork somewhere on your screen so you can watch the effect that you are applying to this. All right. Let's just go through some of these main options here. Let's go down to distance. So in my position, I again am setting the light source. So again, this is like a face of a clock. It looks like it's about 10 o'clock. So if the sun is coming in at that angle, it's going to cast a shadow down at the opposite side. So if this is about 10 o'clock, that means that shadow is going to be around 4 or 5 o'clock, which is what's happening to this piece of artwork. As I crank this around here, you can see that the shadow is moving around the object. I can also change the distance that that shadow is from the object. And if I bring it down, notice that it's impacting the X and the Y offset. Because if I want, I can have the shadow move vertically further away than it is horizontally. I typically bring my drop shadow. I like smaller drop shadows, but of course everybody has a personal preference. I like it more around 3. You can see that when you change these X and Y offsets, it also impacts the distance. The size of the drop shadow, well actually let me move back up to the top. I know I mentioned about multiply, but you see there's a black swatch here. I can click on that and I can change the drop shadow color to something else. Let's say that I wanted a green drop shadow. I've never been a real big fan of colorized drop shadows. For some reason it just has never looked really good in my documents. It always gives me a feeling of some kind of weird fluorescent. But that doesn't mean that there's a project that this isn't going to work. And I also tend to think that the darker colors, so here's a real dark brown, that's working very similar to how the black is working. But I'm going to go back to black, but you can change your drop shadow color. See, we went through distance, the light angle, and let's go down to size. As I change the size, you can see that I'm kind of choking the transparent portion of the shadow, and it's bringing it further into the edge of that object. So if I bring it out, notice that the whole thing seems to be lightening because I'm pushing out the transparency portion further away. And the default is about 5, which I'm going to go ahead and leave that. The spread pushes that opacity even further out. So instead of choking it, it's pushing the opacity portion out. And you can see it becomes a very hard edge. We're really losing that sense of feathering at the edge of the drop shadow, which is what drop shadows are kind of known for. So I tend to leave my spread at 0. Again, this is going to be something that you can choose for personal preference. Now noise is really interesting. Noise, I'm going to really crank this up so you can see what's happening. When you add noise, you are roughing up the drop shadow. Noise is included in anything that has a shadow, any effect that has a shadow portion in it. So that's going to work on that inner shadow. Bevel and emboss is also going to be impacted by noise. And if you push it all the way to the extreme, it gets this real grungy, rough look, right? Kind of a sandpaper look. But if you pull it back, you can have less and less of it. According to many people and printers, if you include just a tiny bit of noise, even 1 or 2%, you will get in the output a more natural looking drop shadow. And 2, if you send it to a professional printer, the drop shadow is going to print easier and it's going to have a better result. So you might just always want to include 1 or 2% in the noise area. And I don't know if I've ever really seen a huge difference in my output, but this is what I've been told. I'm going to ignore object knocks out shadow and shadow honors other effects right at the moment. Just a little bit more advanced, and I really want to keep this very simple. Okay, so there's my photograph. Now let's move over here and talk about what happens if we click on a text box. You don't apply a drop shadow by highlighting the text. Instead, you use the selection tool, which I think is not the most intuitive thing that you would think. I think most people would think, well, I want the drop shadow to be on the B. You cannot apply a drop shadow to individual characters. It's the entire text frame. So you either need to create a text frame with only a couple of characters, or as I'll demonstrate down here, you can convert some of the text to outlines, which means it will no longer be editable with the text tool, but you can get then what looks like a drop shadow over a couple of characters. So I'm going to move to my selection tool. I'm going to zoom in here on this Bodhi. Wait for that to refresh. And I'm just going to do exactly what we've done before. I'm going to hold down my effects menu, choose drop shadow, and I see the default drop shadow appears. So I'm going to tighten that up just a little bit. Get a little bit closer. I'm going to add that 1% here. And I'm getting a pretty nice little drop shadow. Again, I can move that light source around and change the position of that drop shadow. You can see it rotating around. But this is what's kind of interesting. If by default it has used the object, but notice that the shadow is being applied to the text, to the vector portion of the content of this frame. But what happens if I fill this frame with a color? Right now the background of this frame is none, as we can see right here. I'm going to go over to my swatches panel, click on the frame icon, and I'm going to fill it, let's say with yellow. Immediately the drop shadow moves from the text to the edge of the frame. I've lost that drop shadow on the text. So as long as your frame has no fill, InDesign is going to, by default, apply that drop shadow to the text. So how am I going to get around this? I'm going to go back to my effects, and I'm going to turn that drop shadow off with frame, so the object. Then I'm going to go back up to this drop-down menu, and I'm going to choose text. Because now I do have something that can be applied to the object and to the text. And I'm going to turn the drop shadow back on. Again, I'm going to tighten this up a little bit. And I've got my drop shadow on the text, and I do not have a drop shadow on the fill. Though I am more than, InDesign is more than capable of giving me a drop shadow both around the text and around the object. Let's move to a vector image. So vector images are nice and easy to get the effect you're looking for, though the output is a little more difficult for InDesign, a little more complicated. With my cute little turtle here, I'm going to go to my effects panel, and I'm going to choose drop shadow. And you can see, bring this down a little bit, maybe not quite as small as I typically do, but notice that the only place that that drop shadow is being applied is where there's content. So it understands that this has transparency around the edge and that it's just following the edge of that content. Couldn't have asked for anything more. It just really does the job nicely. So let's see, maybe I'm going to make this just slightly smaller here. I'm going to add my 1%, and I'm happy with that drop shadow. Right, drop shadows honor clipping path. This particular image was clipped in Photoshop that it doesn't really acknowledge that in this particular image. This comes from a training book, Classroom in a Book. And what I want to show you is if I select this Photoshop image and I choose Drop Shadow, it has a white background, so it is giving me the drop shadow around the edge of the image. So how can I get it to honor each individual pair? I'm going to get out of the effects, leave the shadow applied, but I'm going to go up to Object, Clipping Path, Options. And I'm going to bring this over here. Right now it's telling me that there is no clipping path. And I can see that one was not created in Photoshop. There's no alpha channel. There's no Photoshop path. If you had created a clipping path, an alpha channel in Photoshop, or created a Photoshop path, this would be darkened and you would be able to select it, and the drop shadow would honor those individual pieces, those three separate pairs. So what I'm going to do is something that we do very similar to with the text wrap option, is that I'm going to ask InDesign to do the best job it can at trying to figure out where those edges are. And it did an okay job. It's not the greatest. I can play around with these tolerances so I can see what that'll do. It kind of smooths out the edge, but I'm still getting these white gaps. And if I increase the tolerance, those white gaps go away. Or actually, I guess I decreased it. Yes, I decreased it. I got rid of the white gaps, but I can also play around with threshold, which is also smoothing this out a little bit. And then I can also inset the frame. So that's like taking a text wrap and choking it closer around the object. And the reason this looks actually halfway decent is because I have already played with this and I chose point 2, P2, 2 points of an inset frame. So this is another option you have if you have a white background in a Photoshop image or a JPEG, and I still have this little tiny white edge, and I could go in to the clipping path and manually modify this because it's essentially taking these settings and turned it into a drawn path, just like we work with text wrap. So everything that I talked about with text wrap applies to this when we're talking about modifying that wrapped edge that it creates. Not too bad. I might want to feather that. The edge of the pear looks like it's getting cut a little bit too heavily. But you can see that this is the effect I'm going to get. It's much better to designate that clipping path, that alpha channel in Photoshop, because then you're going to get exactly what you want when you select it inside of InDesign. All right, let's move down to this text box here. I want to demonstrate this other option. So as I said, if you apply drop shadow to text, it gets applied to everything in that text box. I'm going to have to really choke this up tight or else it's not going to look like anything. In fact, let's bring this size way down. So I can see that that drop shadow has been applied to everything in this text box. So what if I just wanted the words Goose Girl, right? I didn't want any of this other text applied. I would either have to create a separate text box, place it right in line with this so that I could get the line of type. In fact, let's just focus on the word goose, because you can see how difficult this would be to try to get this text box with the word goose drop down into here so that the baselines would align. Instead, what we can do, and I want to show you another thing for removing that effect. We've talked about going in and turning the checkbox off for drop shadow. I can go to the panel menu and choose clear effects or clear all transparency. But this time I'm going to use the option of just clicking on the little trash can in the panel, and that removes the effect. So I'm going to get this text exactly the way I want it, because after what I do now, I'm not going to be able to edit that text again. So sometimes I make a backup copy if this is really something important, so that I don't have to recreate the word goose. I highlight the letters, go to my Type menu, and choose Create Outlines. What this does is it turns the text into a graphic. And if I zoom in here, you can see that each letter is now an individual set of anchor points. This is now a set of Bezier curves, but it's no longer editable by the Type tool. The Type tool is not going to be able to recognize this. But when you're looking at the text zoomed out, it's going to be hard to tell the difference between the text itself and that text that has been turned into outline. At this point, I can select that frame using my selection tool, and I could apply a drop shadow. Again, probably going to want to bring that in really tight and maybe make this a little bit denser here. And we can see that in preview now, I have the drop shadow just around the word goose. So this is an option that you have, but just remember that I cannot go back now and edit this word goose with the Type tool. It's not going to recognize it because it's no longer editable text. All right, so here are different types of drop shadows applied to different types of elements that we've imported. We've got our type, a standard, either any rasterized image, doesn't matter whether it's a TIFF or a JPEG or a Photoshop image. We have our either Illustrator file, basically vector format. So this could be an EPS or an Illustrator file. And then we also have a Photoshop image that has a white background. You could either acknowledge a clipping path that's been created in Photoshop, or you can use Detect Edges to try to create your own. And then of course at the end, taking some of the text in a paragraph, converting it to outline so that it maintains its place in that line of type, and you can apply then the drop shadow to that frame. Let's move to bevel and emboss. I've created several items here so that you can see a comparison of the different options in bevel and emboss. So let's get this up here. I'm going to just select one of these. Oh, by the way, here's another really fun thing you can do. I think it's really a nice option. Let's say that I make a green oval here. And I want this exact same, let's just choose this one, this pillow emboss to be applied to this item. I'm going to go to my effects panel, click on the effect that I'm interested in. This is this pillow emboss. Take my cursor over the top of the FX, and I'm going to drag it on top of this object. So I've just dragged the little FX icon right on top, and the exact same effect is applied to this new object. Pretty cool, huh? I really like that. If you're doing several drop shadows on a page and you've got a setting that you really like, this is a great way to apply it. We also have the ability to take these effects and define them in an object style. You are now familiar with character styles and paragraph styles. InDesign also has table styles and object styles. And an object style allows you to take multiple settings, whether that's fill, stroke, offset, or inset in a text box, effects of all kinds, and give it a name. So this is another way that you can transfer the same settings to multiple objects. But I really like the ability to drag this FX icon over another object. All right. So here is an example of my outer bevel. And your outer bevel applies nothing to the inside of the shape, but the highlight and the shadow is applied to the outside of the shape. So you can see that inside the edges of that shape, nothing is going on. And a bevel and emboss is created just through the use of highlights and shadow with transparency. The inner bevel, if we look at these three, these are all inner bevel, but this is smooth, hard chisel, and soft chisel. And if I can move this over slightly, let's see if we can get that dialog box to appear, if there's room for that. I'm not sure if there is. Well, at least we can see the top three so you know where they're coming from. All right. So here is our bevel and emboss. The style is what's going to allow us to choose either outer bevel, inner bevel, emboss, or pillow emboss. And these are the examples I tried to create so you could get an idea of what the difference is. So the inner bevel is this one. You can see that we really don't get a shadow outside of the shape. That highlight and shadow occurs on the inside of the element. And then of course, if I look at the technique, we have the choice of smooth, which is the first column, chisel hard, which is exemplified in the second column, and chisel soft in the third column. All right, we move down to emboss, and the highlight and shadow appear inside and outside. And pillow emboss is the outside of the object shadow where it's reversed. So if we look at emboss, it looks like the object has been punched up towards us, but if you look at pillow emboss, it's as if something has punched into a soft surface. So take a quick glance at these, get a feel for what each of these are, and then now we'll start going through the different specifications and attributes. I'm trying to find a place to put this so that we can, let's see, let's cancel out of that. I'm going to move this over a little bit more and move it up. Let's try this again. And since we don't need the left portion, because we already know that we've applied bevel and emboss, and we're seeing down below, this is a little bit like our links panel where it's showing you your info about that particular object that you have selected. So it's telling me that it's 100% bevel emboss. I've got a stroke of 100%, no effects applied to the stroke, and the fill is 100% of a particular swatch, and there are no effects. So this has been applied just to the object. Let's move this over here. Okay. Direction, up or down. Take a look at this star, and I'll change that to down, and you can see that now it looks like a cookie cutter turned upside down. I'm going to put that back up. The size increases the highlights and shadows. I'm going to keep increasing this, and you can see that it's almost like a mountain is growing. Let's bring that back. That's a little out of control there. Whoop, not too much. There we go. The chisel techniques, you can see, have a very dramatic difference between them. And as much as chisel soft sounds like it's less dramatic, to me it's more dramatic. So this is where for chisel, the highlights and the shadows follow the edges. And the chisel soft is similar, but it's even more dramatic. We're seeing these finer little detailed lines around the edge. And we can see that that's true for each of these. If you decrease the opacity, you're using the depth. So let me click on, let me cancel out of that. Click on this one here and let me go back in. Let's see if we can get a slightly different effect here. All right. So if I increase the soften, you can see that that edge just becomes less and less apparent, and it just becomes like a smooth button, kind of a slope rather than an edge. Let me bring that back. You can see that edge is getting harder and harder. All right, and if I look at the depth, right now it's at 100. I bring that back, and I'm basically changing the opacity of that effect, which is what I was trying to say a couple seconds earlier, not very effectively. So I'm at 30%, moving back. If I keep moving, I can barely see the edge of that bevel. If I increase it, you can see that that opacity gets harder and harder, and that shadow is at its full depth, and so is the highlight. So the shading area controls the angle and the altitude of the highlights and the shadows. So just as we saw with the drop shadow, if I change my light source, you can see it's having a pretty big effect on where those shadows are going to appear and where the highlights are going to appear. And as I bring that light source further away, it becomes much more bland. You'll see I'm seeing almost all highlight, but the more I move this towards the center, right at that edge, you can see that it's almost as if the light is lower in the horizon moving across, and the right edge I'm seeing a very, very dark shadow. And like I said, the only way you're really going to get a feel for this is to just go in and start playing with these. The altitude, if you have a low altitude, you're going to see far more dark shadows, which is what I was doing basically by changing this angle here. I was changing the altitude. But if you increase the altitude, then you're going to intensify the shadows. So watch the little clock arm here. As I move this down, you see how the little crosshatch is moving closer to the edge? It's moving out. And you'll see that I'm getting more and more shadows until it crosses over that edge. Now I'm going to go back, increase the altitude. That altitude is now coming across the center. Think about a sun moving across the sky, getting higher and higher in the sky. Oops, went the wrong way. Sorry, went the wrong way. And now I'm seeing far more highlights. Let's get it back to something about, that's a little too much. How about around 40 degrees? You can control the highlight and the shadows, opacity and blending mode separately. So if you were going to use, let's say, overlay, I'm not seeing much of a difference. Soft light, that softens the highlight. By default, the highlight is going to be screen because, as I mentioned before, when we're talking about blending modes, screen lightens, multiply darkens. And the swatches chosen are paper for the screen and black for the multiply, which is going to give you the lightest highlight and the darkest shadow. And then we can change these opacities independently. So for the highlight, let's say I wanted a little bit more highlight, but I wanted a little less shadow. Okay, you can see that that shadow is minimizing, becoming lighter and lighter. And I can also intensify that and bring that screen back so there's less highlight and more shadow. So many adjustments we can make to get the look exactly the look we're looking for. But this is a really fun. I want to show you an example of the Bodhi page. We're going to work on this over the next couple of webcasts. So the assignment this week is to take last week's Bodhi quote page, which was also a continuation of Lab 7, and now you're going to create the cover for the magazine article. And then next week, you're going to use the text threading to create the magazine article itself. And when you're done at the end of week 4, or the end of the last lab, before the final lab, you are going to have a short magazine article that's going to compile all of these different labs together. And it's all going to be about the boomtown of Bodie. So if we take a closer look here at the Bodie State Historic Park, this is that bleeding cowboy font, which Cindy's the one who introduced this to me. I had never really worked with it before, but it's a free font. I think it's on the font. You can also just Google bleeding cowboys, but I just love the effect of this font. So I just took this, and I'll also show you a sample that Cindy did for her class. This is kind of her creation. And you can see what she did with this page, and I'm sure I'll be able to find some previous student work to give you guys some ideas. But you can see that the text has had bevel and emboss applied to it, and it almost looks like it's some sort of a metallic rendering of this text, which is really fun. So experiment with using different colors, lighter colors versus darker colors, going in and changing the shadows versus the highlights. I think you guys will have a lot of fun playing with that. You don't have to use it, but it'd be nice if you could use just at least the effects that we're talking about in these webcasts for this week. All right, coming up we are going to talk about basic feather, transparency, and gradient feather, which will make a big difference in what's going on with this page here. Right now I'm sure it looks pretty weird seeing the blue really close up to this background, but you'll see why that was created the way it was in the next webcast. So until then, signing off,